And I thought I would just kick off by saying a few words from the RSPB's perspective, and then we'll kick off with some thoughts from each of the panel members, and then open it up to questions as well. So I thought I would start off just by saying today is equinox. It's the autumn equinox today, which is a time of balance. It's a time of balance, Hilary. When the sun's path crosses the celestial equator. So it's a time of balance in terms of light and dark. And I kind of wish it felt a bit more like that, sitting where we're all sitting right now. But it's just a moment to kind of reflect on the fact that nature is doing its thing while all of this goes on. And of course, we can't kind of sit here and talk about the topics we're going to be talking about without two things, I think, banging around in our heads. One is the recently released Glover review of national parks and AONBs. That came out overnight on Friday, came into the press, I think, on Saturday as well. And then, of course, the youth climate strike on last Friday. I was certainly out in Nottingham, and I'm sure lots of you were out as well. It was a pretty phenomenal thing, actually. And you've only got to look at the global coverage around the world to see the scale of feeling that was being expressed, particularly by young people, but by they'd invited adults to join them as well, about the climate crisis that we're facing into and the nature crisis, of course, that sits hand in hand with that. So those two things, for me, very much kind of frame today's debate. And then we've had some amazing reports that have come through in the last kind of 18 months, really, telling us what we need to worry about. IPCC, IPBES, we've had the Climate Change Committee's advice to our own government about what should be happening. And they have both made it incredibly clear that the climate crisis and the ecological crisis are absolutely hand in hand, both in terms of the impacts that are happening, but in terms of solutions as well. So I hope that we're going to hear quite a lot about nature solutions today, because that's where we've got a huge opportunity, I think, in terms of tackling both those crises at the same time. And of course, we sit here still under the threat of a no-deal exit in terms of Brexit. And I'm sure I don't need to remind you that, you know, the environment sector has huge worries about what that might mean. We've got the Environment Bill we put a lot of work into in the build-up to this moment. We've got the Ag Bill, which is now looking like it's not going to happen, but had some hugely important senses of direction in it around public money for public goods. And we know that we kind of run a risk if we move into a no-deal situation of a race to the bottom in terms of trying to get trade deals and what that might mean for the environment as well. So that is, of course, another huge piece of context for us. So I just wanted to talk a bit about nature, natural climate solutions. And the RSPB has done an interesting piece of work looking at how much carbon is captured in the vegetation and just the top 30 centimetres of soil in our most important areas for nature in the UK. And lo and behold, the two frequently tie together. If you map our most important areas in terms of nature and you map our most important areas in terms of carbon, they overlap. But we've also found that 66% of that carbon in those nature-rich areas lies outside protected areas. So we've got some protected areas where already we know a lot is in unfavourable condition. So when Natural England did its last survey in 2006, we knew that even the protected areas were in unfavourable condition. And we also know that a lot of that carbon lies outside those protected areas as well. And if we lost that carbon from those areas, we would lose 2 gigatons of carbon dioxide. So that's equivalent to 4 years of the UK's greenhouse gas emissions if we lost that. So those areas are incredibly important. And right now, we're not doing enough to protect them or to recover them. And that's a huge issue. And they're in that bad state because of past practice in terms of acidification, in terms of recreational disturbance, drainage, but we've also got current issues going on in terms of intensity of land use in those areas, so intensity of agriculture, intensity of the shooting and the commercial shooting in particular, and also intensity of things like drainage and burning. So we've got quite a lot going on in the uplands that means that we're going backwards rather than forwards in terms of nature recovery. But we are doing good work in terms of trying to make a difference. So if I just dance you through a few examples, in the flow country, Caithness and Sutherland, that of course was the victim of a huge commercial forestry push in the 1980s. And those of you who are old enough to remember, there are quite apocryphal kind of videos of people sticking in commercial forestry while peat is just being ploughed behind on the camera. That's 4 kilometres squared. It's the biggest area in the world in terms of blanket bog, and there's a huge restoration project going on there. 2 million trees still to come out, but a huge restoration piece going on there at the moment to get that blanket bog into better condition. If you think of things like the cairngorms, you've got ancient Caledonian pinewood. So there's a big project going on at the moment there. You've got Scots pine, birch, rowan, alder, willow, lots of heather moorland, and trying to expand that area and also, again, block ditches, stop the drainage of that area, keep it wet where it needs to be wet and keep the carbon in the ground. Of course, the Pennines and the North York Moors coming down the UK. So that's England's largest area of blanket bog in the Pennines and the North York Moors. Only 14% of that SSSI is in good condition. And again, that's drainage, heather burning, overgrazing. So lots of blocking of drains, lots of bog vegetation restoration, putting back sphagnum, putting back cotton grass, making sure that that vegetation is in a better state. And if you come down to the Wash, on the eastern side of England, come down to the Wash and the North Norfolk coast, you've got intertidal salt marsh there, so coastal realignment. We know that's going to be a big issue as we face into climate change. And there's land reclamation that's gone on in the past, and really that's about trying to allow water back in to create better areas for wildlife, but also to hang on to the carbon and get more carbon being stored in that salt marsh going forward. And we estimate we're going to need about 5 times increase in rate of realignment than we've had since 2000. So coastal realignment is going to be really important going forward. And then just moving down to somewhere like the Chilterns. So interestingly, the Chilterns was one of the areas that the Glover Review suggested could become a national park. It's currently in AOMB at the moment. And the Chilterns is a really good example of more southerly areas where we've got sort of fragmented nature. We've got fragmented nature, grassland, woodland, but actually it's not protected. It's not protected well enough at all at the moment. And I think we run a big loss of losing those fragmented areas where we haven't got that overarching protection. So, this is the situation we find ourselves in when we think particularly about the uplands and blanket bog, but think about national parks and our protected areas. And it is about intensity of land use, I think. So it is about intensity of agriculture, intensity of tree planting, intensity of shooting. And I think the situation we've got to look into is one where land needs to deliver on a multitude of purposes for us going forward. And that's actually, it is a social justice issue. It's about land delivering across the board for people. And we've got to, I think, make some quite big shifts to enable that to happen. It is, I think, without doubt, the fight against climate change and the fight against species loss is the fight of our generation. I know there's a lot going on around Brexit at the moment, but it is, in my mind, that is a distraction. It is the fight of our generation. We have to get this right. And we need to be doing a lot more and spending a lot more in order to do that. So there's been some work done with the National Trust and with the Wildlife Trust recently that indicates that £3 billion, which is the amount we spend under cap at the moment on farming, absolutely needs to go into restoring nature through farming going forward. And we've also done another piece of work that looks at how much of GDP should be spent on trying to tackle climate change and tackle the loss of nature, and we estimate it needs to be about 2% of GDP going forward. So that's going up from about 17 billion to about 42 billion a year. Sounds a lot of money, but actually in relative terms, it's 2% of GDP. So that's the kind of shift I think we need to make. And, I think in terms of kind of listening to the science is really clear around this. We need to listen to it, we need to respond, we need to move at scale, and we need to do it now. That's enough from me.